Why, hello. So, my name is Dan Faustino, and, well, this is my first YouTube video, and I have some stuff to talk about today, that I want to talk about. And, so you'll have to bear with me because I don't know how this is going to go. Um, but hopefully, the more I do this, the better I will get at articulating my thoughts and being able to express my ideas about video games and I suppose specifically Final Fantasy stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what I want to talk about today in this video is what it means to be an RPG and whether the term is even outdated or not. And I would kind of say it is. And what really brought this up is Final Fantasy XVI, right? And we seem to be pretty divided on even liking this game. But many people have brought up that this game feels like a character action game or some such. And that it's not even really an RPG. And it's like, it begs the question of like, well, what does an RPG even mean? And is Final Fantasy XVI even an RPG? Should we even be calling them RPGs anymore? What does it mean to be an RPG? Is it turn-based? Does it mean that there's, a progression system like leveling up your characters? Does it mean that the game is story-based? Is it because it has a fantasy setting? What does it even really mean? And so I think I have a solution as to what we should call these games. Is to really think about it in terms of like, what is the underlying thing that makes all of these games what they are? And what really prompted me to think about this was a few years ago, was around the time that Final Fantasy VII Remake came out. And I was talking to a coworker at the time, and he was certainly not happy with the fact that they had gone into an action-oriented direction with the remake. And I think this was after the demo had come out. And I said to him, well, it is kind of like command-based. And so it's still retaining that like command-based element that the original game had. And that's really, in my eyes, the key word here, right, is command. And so I really think that that's probably what we should be calling these games from now on, because that's really what you do in all of these games. So the people complaining, that it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, not my Final Fantasy, like, I hear you. And part of the reason for that is because all of the games up to this point, at least all the other 15 games, had some element of command involved, right? With the exception of maybe Final Fantasy 15. But that game is a disaster piece, if you ask me, and I'm not even sure if that game knows precisely what type of game it's trying to be. So, but, Final Fantasy 16, for all intents and purposes, is really the first game where it's clear that it's just not command-based at all. And so, you can describe in a number of different ways. So there's different types, right? So you've got, like, turn-based command, which would be, like, the old-school Final Fantasy games. And then there's, like, action command, which would be Final Fantasy VII Remake. And then something like, and what I would describe a lot of the strategy RPGs, that's what we would call them, I would call them positional command games. Right, because really what you do in those games is the whole strategy is around positioning your characters. And so this also is part of the reason that people almost wrongly critique Final Fantasy XVI's combat system, right? So they'll say things like, oh, well, the game doesn't have an elemental-based system, or it doesn't have, status ailments. Like, you don't get poisoned and you don't get, paralyzed in this game. And it's like, well, that's because it's not really a command game, right? It's not even really trying to be one, right? There's no party members. And I don't know that party members is inherently something that has to be part of a command game, but it's certainly part and parcel of it, right? The first ever command game, I guess you could say, was probably Dragon Quest 1, where you only played as a single character. But it took literally one game before the developers were like, yeah, how do we make this interesting? And then they started adding party members in Dragon Quest 2, right? You get 3 characters in that game. And so, there's maybe the only other game I can really think of that doesn't have party members in a command game is like maybe Lightning Returns, which, by the way, I didn't actually play that game, so I can't really speak much to that or how it exactly works. But, if you don't have party members, you're going to have to get a bit creative with things. And so, you can imagine that if there were status ailments in this game, you'd probably be even more upset at the combat system. Like, imagine if suddenly you got stoned, or, well, some of y'all are probably, like, excited to hear that they got stoned. We'll use the term petrified. We'll say you were petrified, right? It's like, well, who the hell is going to get you out of that state, right? Like, you're just going to sit there and be petrified and you just do nothing? Like, then you would complain, right? You'd say, well, the game sucks and the status ailments don't make sense and yada, yada, yada. Well, that's because it's not a command game, right? See, if it were a command game, then guess what you'd have to do? You'd have to open up a menu and you'd have to select from a command menu what item. You'd have to select a gold needle in Final Fantasy's case, right, which would usually heal petrification. And so you could argue maybe they could have gotten creative with Torgal with this, but you don't have party members in this game, so how is that going to work? Right? The other criticism that this game gets is that it doesn't have an elemental based system, and it's like, again, you don't have a party in this game. You don't really have commands per se. And you're just playing as one character, so you always have pretty much the entire with Clive, right? You always have the entire assortment of your abilities with Clive. And so let's imagine for a moment that you're fighting a boss and let's say they designed an elemental based system and he's weak to fire. Well, then all you would do in the game is just, there would be no incentive to switch. All you would do is just pick the Phoenix icon, right? And you would just fight the boss with the Phoenix icon. You would never switch between any of the other icon abilities. There would be no incentive to. So then what you'd have to do if you were designing enemies in this game is you'd have to make a system where the boss, changes his elemental affinity mid-combat. And then it's like, okay, sure, that now so he went from fire to ice, and now you got to switch to Shiva, and then you've got to learn his pattern. Are you going to do that in every single fight in this game? Like, is that how that gimmick would get real tiresome after, like, 1 or 2 bosses of them doing that. So, I don't know that would work in this game, right? So this game is really what I would classify as a precision combat game, which is, it's about comboing, it's about, timing your button presses, right? You got to remember that if you press square and then switch to this, to this icon ability, then jump in the air and then do an aerial combo. Like, this is how, that's kind of the way that those games work, right? It's not so much about strategizing which commands you're going to use so much as it is almost route memorization and learning the patterns of enemies and how to dodge them, right? A lot of this game is focused on precision dodging, which is another complaint a lot of people have. But that's kind of what you do in these games. And so I hear you. Like, this game isn't probably what you wanted from Final Fantasy. And that's partially because, well, they can get away with calling it an RPG. Whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, I don't know. Like, so, and that's the issue, right? Is that you can Square Enix can just get away with calling this an RPG, even though it's not really an RPG. Or is it? I don't know. It's certainly not a command game, though. And if we had been calling them that prior to this game's release, who knows if they would have even... I think it's debatable as to whether they would have even made this game in the way that they did, right? They wouldn't have been able to publicly come out and go, yeah, we're making a game like Devil May Cry now, and we're not making Final Fantasy anymore. And so people, it would, you know, like if they said it wasn't a command game and that was the vernacular that we used to describe all these games up to this point, they probably wouldn't have even made this game that way, because they know it would not have gone over particularly well with the fan base, and that people would be upset about it. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you think my idea is stupid, should we be calling them command games now? Should we call them something else? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, remember to subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in another video.